The scream cut through the great hall before Elena even realized it had come from her own throat. "Nobody believes me." The words bounced off the stone walls and died in silence. 40 pairs of eyes stared back at her, and not one of them held warmth. She stood alone in the center of the circle, her hands shaking, her chest rising and falling too fast. Around her, the pack had gathered in a wide ring, the way they always did when judgment was about to be passed. Torches burned along the walls, throwing long shadows across the floor, and somewhere behind her, she could hear someone whisper her name, like it was already a curse. "I didn't take anything," she said again, quieter this time, because shouting had gotten her nowhere. "I swear on my life, I never went near the vault." Dorian, the pack's enforcer, stepped forward with his arms crossed over his chest. He was a broad man, with a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw, and he had never once looked at Elena with anything close to kindness. "The seal was broken," he said, his voice flat and final. "Your scent was on the door. What more do you need? Some kind of written confession?" "That doesn't mean I did it," Elena said. "Anyone could have." "Anyone didn't," Dorian cut her off. "You did. Or you're going to stand there and tell 40 witnesses that your own scent lied to them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena searched the faces around her, looking for even one person who might step forward, who might say, "Wait, let's slow down. Let's actually think about this." She found Marin, a woman she had shared meals with for the past 3 years. Marin looked away. She found Callum, a boy she had once helped through his first shift, back when he was terrified of his own body changing under the moon. Callum stared at the floor. Even Ivy, who had cried on Elena's shoulder after losing her mother, kept her eyes fixed on some invisible point past Elena's head, as if looking at her directly might make the accusation somehow contagious. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke in her defense. The silence was its own kind of verdict, heavier than any words Dorian could have thrown at her. "I want to know who told you my scent was on that door," Elena said, forcing her voice to stay steady, even though her whole body wanted to shake apart. "Because I was nowhere near the Eastern Hall last night. I was at the river. Ask anyone who—" "We asked," Dorian said. "Nobody saw you at the river. That doesn't mean I wasn't there. It means nobody happened to see me. Convenient. It's the truth." Dorian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might strike her right there in front of everyone. Instead, he turned to the rest of the pack, spreading his arms as if presenting evidence at a trial nobody had asked to attend. The vault held every record this pack has kept for the last 10 years. Territory agreements, alliances, names of every pack member, and every outsider who's ever set foot near our land. Someone broke that seal, and someone took what was inside. We have a scent match. We have no alibi. What else do you want me to bring you before you're satisfied? "The truth," Elena said again, because it was the only thing she had left to hold on to. Dorian scoffed and turned his back on her, which was somehow worse than if he had kept arguing. It told everyone in that hall that the conversation was over, that there was nothing left to discuss, that Elena's guilt had already been decided somewhere in a room she had never been invited into. That was when she noticed him. In the far corner of the hall, half hidden by the shadow of a support beam, stood a man who had not said a single word since the gathering began. Elena knew who he was, of course. Everyone did. Kale. The pack's second in command, the one they called the Silent Alpha, because in 3 years she had never once heard him raise his voice, never seen him laugh at the fire pit with the others, never watched him join the easy banter that filled the dining hall most evenings. He kept to the edges of every room, watching more than speaking, and most of the younger pack members were a little afraid of him, simply because he was impossible to read. He was not looking away from her. While everyone else found somewhere else to direct their eyes, Kale was watching Elena directly, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. It should not have meant anything. He had said nothing to defend her. He had made no move to step forward. And yet something about the way he stood there, arms loose at his sides instead of crossed like Dorian's, made her chest ache in a strange new way. Like maybe, just maybe, someone in that room was actually thinking, instead of simply reacting. "Elena of the River Pack," Dorian said, using her full lineage name the way people only did when they wanted to remind you exactly how far you might fall. "By the law of this territory, theft from the vault carries exile. You have 3 days to gather what you can carry. After that, you no longer belong here." The words landed like a physical blow. Exile. Not punishment, not probation, not even a chance to prove herself over time. Just gone. Erased from the only home she had ever known. Cast out to survive alone in territory that did not belong to anyone, where rogue wolves and worse things waited for anyone foolish enough to wander without a pack at their back. "Please," Elena said, and she hated how small her voice sounded now, how far it had fallen from the fire she'd had only minutes ago. "Please, just listen to me. I would never betray this pack. You've known me since I was a child. Ask my mother. Ask." "Your mother is 3 winters gone," Dorian said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "There is no one left standing here to vouch for you, Elena. That is exactly the problem." The crowd began to shift, some already turning toward the doors, eager to put distance between themselves and whatever was about to happen next. Elena felt the ground tilt beneath her, felt the walls of the hall pressing closer even though nothing had physically moved. She was drowning in a room full of people who used to call her friend, and not one of them would reach out a hand to pull her back up. She looked again at the corner where Cale stood. He had not moved. He had not spoken. But his eyes stayed on her, steady and unblinking, and for one strange moment it felt like he was the only solid thing left in a room that had turned to smoke around her. Dorian clapped his hands once, a sharp sound that echoed through the hall and signaled the gathering was finished. People began to file out in 2s and 3s, murmuring to each other, some glancing back at Elena with something that might have been pity and might have been relief that it wasn't them standing in the center of that circle. Marin left without a word. Callum left without a word. Ivy paused just long enough to give Elena a look that seemed to say "I'm sorry," before she too disappeared through the great doors. Within minutes, the hall was nearly empty. Elena stood alone in the center of the circle, the torches burning low, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could hold her own body together, through sheer force of will. 3 days. She had 3 days to accept an unearned punishment, or find some way to prove her innocence, in a pack that had already made up its mind. She thought she was completely alone until she heard footsteps. Not the heavy, deliberate stride of Dorian coming back to deliver some final cruelty. Something quieter, careful. She turned, half expecting to find no one there, and found Cale standing several feet away, close enough to speak but far enough to respect the space around her. He said nothing at first. He simply looked at her, the same steady attention he had given her from across the hall, except now there was no distance between them to soften it. Up close, she noticed things she had never had reason to notice before. The faint scar along his knuckles, the way his eyes were a shade of gray that seemed to shift depending on the light. The stillness in him that wasn't emptiness, she realized now, but control. "You didn't say anything," Elena finally managed, her voice cracking on the last word. "In there. You didn't say a single thing." "No," Cale agreed. "I didn't." "Then why are you here now?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might simply turn and walk away like everyone else had. Instead he said, "Because in there, anything I said would have been ignored." Dorian had already decided the outcome before the gathering started. Arguing with him in front of 40 witnesses would not have changed his mind. It would only have told him I was paying attention. "And now you want him to think you're not?" "I want him to think exactly what he already thinks," Cale said. "That I don't get involved in matters like this. That I watch, and I say nothing, and I let the pack sort out its own business." Elena felt something sharp rise in her chest, something close to anger, even though she knew it wasn't fair to direct it at him. "So you agree with him? You think I stole from the vault?" "No," Cale said, and the single word landed with more weight than anything Dorian had said all night. "I don't think that at all." She stared at him, waiting for him to say more, but he simply held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between them, the way it seemed to naturally do with him. "Then why didn't you say so?" she asked, her voice breaking, despite her best effort to keep it steady. "Why didn't you tell them they were wrong? I'm about to lose everything, Cale. My home, my pack, everything I've ever known, because nobody in that room was willing to ask a single real question." "I'm asking questions," Cale said quietly, "just not in front of an audience that already has its answer." Elena wanted to believe him, She wanted to believe that his silence in the hall had meant something other than cowardice or indifference, that there was some deeper strategy behind standing in the shadows while she was condemned in front of everyone she had ever trusted. But 3 days was such a short window, and belief without proof was a fragile thing to build a future on. "You have until the third night," Cale said, as if he could read the doubt written across her face. "Don't leave before then. Not for exile, and not because you've given up. Give me that much time." "To do what?" "To find out who actually broke that seal," he said. "Because I don't believe it was you, and I intend to prove it before Dorian gets the chance to make your exile permanent." The words should have brought her relief. Instead, they only opened a new kind of fear, because now there was something to lose beyond her own home. If Cale was wrong, if his quiet confidence turned out to be nothing more than empty comfort, she would spend her last free hours chasing a hope that never had any real weight behind it. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You've barely spoken 2 words to me in 3 years." Something shifted behind his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. "Maybe I've been paying more attention than you realized," he said. "Get some rest, Elena. You'll need it." He turned and walked toward the doors, his steps unhurried, his shoulders carrying the same quiet composure he'd shown throughout the entire gathering. Elena watched him go, torn between the desperate hope his words had planted, and the fear that hope itself might be the cruelest trick of all. She stood alone in the empty hall for a long time after he left, the torches burning lower, the shadows growing longer across the stone floor. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls, the person who had actually broken the seal was walking free, sleeping soundly, probably relieved that Elena's name had absorbed all the suspicion meant for someone else. 3 days. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart still racing beneath it, and made herself a quiet promise. Whatever happened next, whether Cale's strange, silent conviction turned out to be real or not, she would not simply disappear into exile without a fight. She had spent her whole life believing that loyalty and hard work were enough to secure her place in this pack. Tonight had taught her otherwise. Nobody was going to hand her justice. If she wanted it, she would have to help find it herself. She left the hall through a side door, avoiding the main corridor where she might run into anyone from the gathering, anyone who might look at her with that same mixture of pity and suspicion she couldn't bear to see again tonight. The night air outside was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, and for the first time in hours, she let herself breathe deeply, let the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. Above her, the moon hung high and full, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. She used to find comfort in that indifference, in the way the moon simply existed regardless of pack politics or personal disasters. Tonight it felt like one more thing that had turned its face away from her. She walked toward the small cabin at the edge of the territory that she had called home since childhood, the same cabin where her mother had once tucked her into bed and told her that the pack was family, that family did not abandon each other no matter what storms came. Elena wondered now if her mother had believed that completely, or if some quiet part of her had always known that even family could turn away when it was convenient. Inside the cabin, she lit a single candle and sat at the small wooden table where she had eaten 1,000 meals throughout her life. She thought about Marin's averted eyes, Callum's silence, Ivy's whispered apology that had done nothing to actually help her. She thought about Dorian's flat, unyielding voice pronouncing her exile, as if it were the easiest decision in the world. And she thought about Cale, standing in the shadows, the only person in that entire hall who had looked directly at her instead of away. 3 days. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. She did not know yet whether to trust the strange, quiet promise he had made her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty, as she blew out the candle and lay down in the dark. She was not going to spend those 3 days simply waiting for her fate to be decided by other people. If nobody else in this pack was willing to look for the truth, then she would look for it herself, with or without the Silent Alpha's help. But some small, stubborn part of her hoped, more than she wanted to admit, that he had meant every word he said. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the circle of faces again, the averted eyes, the flat judgment in Dorian's voice. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fear, a single thought kept surfacing, steady as a heartbeat. Someone in that hall knew the truth. And for the first time since the accusation had been spoken aloud, Elena was no longer entirely alone in wanting to find out who. The 3 days had already begun, and somewhere out past the edge of the territory, in the deep silence of the pine forest, the real thief slept without a single worry weighing on their conscience, believing the matter had already been settled in their favor. They had no idea that the silent alpha in the corner of the hall had just decided otherwise. The knock came just before dawn, 3 quiet taps against the wooden door of Elena's cabin, and she was awake instantly, her heart slamming against her ribs, before her mind had even caught up with the sound. She had not truly slept. She had spent most of the night sitting upright against the headboard, listening to every creak of the cabin settling around her, half convinced that Dorian would send someone to drag her out before her 3 days were even finished. When the knock finally came, she nearly knocked over the candle beside her bed, reaching for it. "Who's there?" she called, her voice rougher than she intended. "Cale." She crossed the small room and opened the door to find him standing in the pale gray light of early morning, a plain cloak thrown over his shoulders, his expression as unreadable as it had been the night before. Behind him, the forest was still wrapped in mist, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was calling out the first notes of the day. "You said 3 days," she said, stepping aside to let him in, though a part of her wondered if she should be inviting the pack's second-in-command into her home at all. "It's barely been 1 night." "I don't waste time," Cale said, stepping past her into the small cabin. His eyes moved briefly around the room, taking in the modest furnishings, the single candle, the folded blanket on a chair that had clearly been used through a sleepless night, rather than an actual bed. He said nothing about what he saw, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a piece of information being quietly filed away. "I want to know everything you remember about last night," he said, turning back to her. "Before the accusation. Every detail, even the ones that seem unimportant. Where you were, who you saw, what time you returned to your cabin." Elena rubbed her eyes, trying to piece the previous evening back together, through the fog of exhaustion and fear. "I was at the river," she said. "I go there most evenings after my shift ends at the storehouse. It's quiet. I like to sit by the water before the moon rises fully." "Alone?" "Yes. No one saw you there." "I didn't think anyone needed to," she said, a flash of frustration rising in her chest. "I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't expecting to need an alibi for sitting by a river." Cale nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer, and was not troubled by it. "What time did you leave the river?" "I'm not sure exactly. Maybe 2 hours before the gathering was called. I walked back through the eastern path, past the old grain store, and went straight to my cabin. I didn't go anywhere near the vault." "The eastern path," Cale repeated, something sharpening behind his eyes. "That path runs close to the vault entrance." "Close, but not through it," Elena said quickly. "There's a fork before you reach the vault doors. I took the fork that leads back toward the cabins." "But you were in the area," Cale said. "Close enough that your scent could have drifted, or close enough that someone walking the same path could claim they smelled you nearer to the vault than you actually were." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, as the pieces began to arrange themselves into a shape she hadn't considered before. "You think someone used that? You think someone knew I walked that path and built the accusation around it?" "I think it's possible," Cale said carefully. "Scent evidence isn't as precise as Dorian made it sound last night. It can drift, it can linger, it can be misread by anyone eager to reach a particular conclusion. If someone knew your habits, knew you walked near that path most evenings, it wouldn't be difficult to point toward you and claim your scent was found closer to the vault than it truly was." "Then why didn't you say that in the hall?" Elena asked, the same frustration from the night before rising again. "Why let them go through with the sentencing if you already suspected this?" "Because suspecting something and proving it are very different things," Cale said. "If I stand up in front of the whole pack and say the evidence might have been misread, Dorian will ask me for proof. I have none yet. All I would accomplish is showing my hand before I have anything solid to play." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that showing his hand might have been worth it if it meant buying her more time, more room to breathe. But some part of her recognized the sense in his caution, however much it frustrated her in the moment. Dorian was not a man who would be swayed by possibility. He needed certainty, and right now, certainty belonged entirely to the version of events that placed the blame on her. Who else knew about your habit of walking by the river? Cale asked. Elena thought about it, running through the faces of the people she considered friends, people who had shared meals with her, worked beside her, laughed with her around the fire pit on quiet evenings. Almost everyone, honestly. It's not a secret. I've done it for years. Then that doesn't narrow things down as much as I'd hoped, Cale said, more to himself than to her. But it does tell us something important. Whoever set this up either knew exactly where you'd be, or got lucky that your habits lined up conveniently with their plan. I don't like relying on luck as an explanation. It usually means we're missing something. He moved toward the small window of her cabin, looking out at the mist still clinging to the trees, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Elena wonder just how much was happening behind that careful, unreadable exterior he wore like armor. I need to see the vault, he said finally. Not the seal itself. That's already broken, and won't tell us much more than we already know. I need to see who has access to that hall, who was on watch duty last night, and who reported seeing your scent there in the first place. Dorian said 40 witnesses, Elena said. That's what he told the whole pack. 40 witnesses to the accusation, Cale corrected. Not 40 witnesses to the actual theft. There's a difference, and it's one Dorian conveniently blurred last night. I want to know exactly how many people actually claim to have detected your scent near that vault, and exactly when they claim to have detected it. Elena felt a small, cautious flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the accusation began. Hope. Not the wild, desperate kind that came from simply wanting things to be different, but something steadier, built on the careful, methodical way Cale was already pulling apart the story that had been used to condemn her. Why are you being so careful about this? She asked. You could just tell Dorian you don't believe the evidence, and let your position settle the matter. You're the second in command. Doesn't your word carry weight? My word carries weight, Cale said, which is exactly why I can't spend it carelessly. If I challenge Dorian without solid proof, and I'm wrong, or even if I'm right but can't demonstrate it clearly enough, I lose credibility for the next time it actually matters. And there may come a time when this pack needs my word to carry weight far more than it does right now. There was something in the way he said it, something that suggested this wasn't only about Elena, though she couldn't quite place what deeper current ran beneath his words. She decided not to press it, not yet. There would be time for other questions once the more urgent one, the question of her own innocence, had been settled. What do you need from me? She asked instead. Stay visible, Cale said. Don't hide in this cabin for the next 2 days, waiting for your fate to be decided. Go about your routine as normally as you can, even though I know that will be difficult. I want anyone involved in this to believe nothing has changed, that you're simply waiting to accept your exile. If they think the matter is settled, they'll be less careful. People make mistakes when they think no one is still watching. And what will you be doing? Watching, Cale said simply. The way I always do. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her, with an expression that was different from the careful neutrality he'd worn through most of their conversation. Something softer, though still guarded. I meant what I said last night, Elena. I don't believe you did this, and I don't intend to let Dorian send you into exile for something you didn't do, not while there's still time to prove otherwise. Why do you care so much? She asked again, because his answer the night before had felt like only half of something larger. He was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the door frame. Because I've watched this pack fail people before, he said finally. I've watched good people get pushed out, because it was easier than asking hard questions. I don't intend to watch it happen again, if I have the power to stop it. Before she could ask him what he meant, who he had watched the pack fail before, he was gone, disappearing into the mist with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to carry into everything he did. Elena stood in the doorway of her cabin for a long moment after he left, watching the gray light slowly brighten into full morning. 2 days remained. 2 days to either find the truth or lose everything she had ever known. She thought about his instruction to stay visible, to go about her routine as if nothing had changed, and the very idea of walking through the pack grounds under the weight of 40 averted glances made her stomach turn. But she thought too about the alternative, about hiding in this cabin counting down the hours until exile became inevitable, and she knew which option she could actually live with. She dressed quickly, pulling on her work clothes for her usual shift at the storehouse, and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The walk from her cabin to the storehouse took her directly past the center of the pack grounds, past the dining hall, where breakfast was already being served, past clusters of pack members gathered in low conversation that stopped the moment she came into view. She kept her chin up and her pace steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her crumble in public the way she had nearly crumbled in the great hall the night before. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers that started up again the moment she passed, but she did not slow down, did not look away, did not give any of them the reaction they seemed to be waiting for. At the storehouse, her supervisor, an older woman named Greta, who had worked there for as long as Elena could remember, glanced up when she walked in, and then quickly looked back down at the inventory ledger in front of her, saying nothing. "Morning," Elena said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Greta hesitated, then said, "Morning," without meeting her eyes, and the small exchange, ordinary as it should have been, felt like a tiny victory, simply because it had happened at all. The morning passed in a blur of familiar tasks, counting supplies, organizing shipments, the kind of quiet, repetitive work that usually calmed Elena's mind, but today only gave her too much space to think. She found herself watching the faces of everyone who passed through the storehouse, wondering which of them might know something about the vault, which of them might be the one who had actually broken that seal, and let her carry the blame instead. It could have been anyone. That was the terrifying part. Nearly 40 people had gathered in that hall the night before, and any one of them could have been the person responsible, standing among the crowd, watching her get sentenced to exile with a carefully composed expression of concern, hiding whatever guilt actually lived underneath. By midday, she had convinced herself that Cale's plan, whatever its exact shape turned out to be, was the only real chance she had. She could not investigate the vault herself, not without raising exactly the kind of suspicion that would confirm Dorian's narrative rather than dismantle it. All she could do was exactly what Cale had asked: stay visible, stay steady, and trust that somewhere behind his careful, unreadable exterior, he was doing everything he'd promised. As the afternoon sun began sinking lower, casting long shadows across the pack grounds, Elena caught sight of a figure moving along the tree line at the edge of her vision, too far to identify clearly, but familiar enough in the way they carried themselves that she was almost certain it was Cale, moving with quiet purpose toward the direction of the vault. She did not call out to him, did not draw attention to what she'd seen. She simply finished her shift, walked back to her cabin through the same gauntlet of averted eyes and half-whispered conversations, and allowed herself, for the first time since the accusation, to believe that someone in this pack was actually working to uncover the truth. 2 days remained, and somewhere out there, the real thief was still walking free, still believing the matter had been settled, still unaware that the silent alpha had begun quietly pulling apart every thread of the story that had been built to bury an innocent woman. By the second morning, the whispers had grown teeth. Elena noticed it the moment she stepped out of her cabin, where before there had been averted eyes and low murmurs, now there were open stares, small groups that didn't even bother lowering their voices as she passed. She caught fragments of conversation carried on the cold morning air, words like thief and disgrace and good riddance, spoken by people who had once called her a friend, or at least a familiar face worth a nod of acknowledgement in passing. She kept walking, refusing to let her steps falter, though every word landed like a small stone thrown at her back. At the storehouse, Greta was waiting for her with an expression Elena had never seen on the older woman's face before, something caught between sympathy and fear. "You shouldn't be here," Greta said quietly, before Elena had even crossed the threshold. "I still have work to do," Elena said. "I haven't been exiled yet." "Dorian came by this morning," Greta said, glancing toward the door, as if worried someone might overhear. "He said the sentence stands regardless of what happens over the next 2 days. He said you're wasting your time trying to prove anything, that the pack has already decided, and continuing to walk around like nothing's wrong is only making things worse for yourself." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "He's trying to scare me into leaving early." "Maybe," Greta said. "Or maybe he really believes it's already settled and doesn't understand why you're still fighting it." "Do you believe it's settled?" Elena asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Greta hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena found an answer more honest than any words could have given her. "I don't know what to believe," Greta finally said. I've known you since you were small enough to hide behind your mother's skirts during pack gatherings. I don't want to believe you'd do something like this. But the evidence they described sounded convincing, Elena. Scent doesn't usually lie. It can be misread, Elena said, echoing Cale's words from the morning before, though she didn't dare mention his name. Scent drifts. It lingers in places it shouldn't. If someone knew my habits, knew where I walked most evenings, it wouldn't be hard to point toward me even if I was never actually near that vault. Greta studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes. I hope you're right, she said finally. For your sake, and for the pack's. Because if you're telling the truth, that means someone else among us did this, and let you take the blame instead. That's a frightening thought, Elena. Easier for people to believe the story that's already been handed to them. The words stayed with Elena for the rest of the morning, turning over and over in her mind as she worked. Easier for people to believe the story that's already been handed to them. That was exactly the problem, wasn't it? The truth required effort, required people to question something they'd already accepted, required them to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that the real threat was still walking freely among them. Exile was so much simpler. It gave everyone a clean resolution, a villain safely removed from their midst, and no reason to look any closer at their own friends and neighbors. She didn't see Cale at all that day, and the absence gnawed at her more than she wanted to admit. Had he found nothing? Had Dorian discovered what he was doing and shut it down before it could go anywhere? By the time evening fell and she made her way back to her cabin, the doubt had grown heavy enough that she nearly convinced herself the entire conversation from 2 mornings ago had been some kind of fever dream, a desperate hope her mind had conjured, because the alternative, facing this alone, was too unbearable to accept. She was wrong. He appeared at her door just as the last light was fading from the sky, slipping inside the moment she opened it, his expression carrying an intensity she hadn't seen from him before. I found something, he said, without any of the preamble he'd used the morning before. It's not everything, but it's enough to start pulling the thread. Elena's heart leapt. What did you find? The watch schedule for the night the vault was broken into, Cale said, pulling a small folded paper from beneath his cloak and laying it on her table. I got a copy from the record keeper, someone who owes me a favor, and knows how to keep quiet about it. 3 names were assigned to watch the eastern grounds that night, the same area that includes both the river path and the vault entrance. Elena leaned over the paper, scanning the names written there. Finn, Rosalind, Nolan. Finn and Rosalind both confirmed seeing nothing unusual, Cale said. Standard report, nothing out of the ordinary. But Nolan's report is different. He claims he detected your scent near the vault entrance, at roughly the time the seal would have been broken. I told you, I never went near the vault, Elena said, frustration creeping back into her voice. I took the fork toward the cabins. I believe you, Cale said, which means either Nolan is mistaken or Nolan is lying. Why would he lie? Elena asked. I barely know him. We've spoken maybe a handful of times. That's what I intend to find out, Cale said. But there's something else that troubles me more than his report alone. I checked the storehouse ledgers from the past few months, the ones that track who's been assigned to overnight watch duty near the vault. Nolan has requested that assignment far more often than any other pack member over the last 6 months. Nearly every time the Eastern Watch rotation comes up, he volunteers for it. Elena frowned, trying to piece together what that might mean. You think he's been planning this for a while? I think it's worth asking why a pack member with no particular connection to record-keeping or vault security has made a habit of positioning himself exactly where he'd need to be if he wanted access to that vault without raising suspicion, Cale said. Volunteering for overnight watch isn't unusual on its own, but the pattern is. Then confront him, Elena said. Ask him directly. Not yet, Cale said, and the caution in his voice made her chest tighten with impatience. If Nolan is involved, and I ask him outright, he'll simply deny it, and then he'll know we're looking in his direction. He could destroy whatever evidence still exists. Or worse, he could go to Dorian first, and frame the investigation as an attempt to shift blame away from you through desperation. Right now, we have suspicion. We need proof. We don't have time for proof, Elena said, the fear she'd been holding back all day finally breaking through. I have 1 day left, Cale. 1 day before Dorian makes this permanent. I can't afford to wait for you to build a careful case piece by piece. I need something now. Kale's expression softened, just slightly. The first real crack she'd seen in his composed exterior since this had all begun. "I know," he said, "which is why I'm not planning to wait until tomorrow evening to act. I have one more place to check tonight, and if what I suspect is true, it should give us exactly what we need." "What place?" "Nolan's quarters," Kale said. "If he took something from that vault, records, documents, anything valuable enough to be worth this kind of risk, he wouldn't have destroyed it immediately. Whatever he stole likely has value, precisely because of what it contains, which means he's probably holding on to it, at least for now, until he decides what to do with it." "That's a serious accusation to act on without permission," Elena said. "If you're caught searching another pack member's quarters without cause, Dorian will use it against both of us. Which is why I don't intend to get caught," Kale said, a faint, humorless edge of something like determination crossing his features. "I need you to do something for me while I search. I need you to make sure Nolan is occupied elsewhere for at least an hour tonight." Elena's stomach twisted. "You want me to distract him?" "Not directly," Kale said quickly, seeing the alarm on her face. "I don't want you anywhere near him alone, not given what we suspect. I have another pack member who can help, someone I trust to keep him occupied at the dining hall under an ordinary excuse. What I need from you is simpler. I need you to stay here, stay visible if anyone comes looking, and be ready to meet me at the old grain store once I've finished, so we can go over what I find together, before anyone else knows it exists." Elena nodded slowly, though the tension in her chest hadn't eased at all. "And if you don't find anything?" "Then we keep looking," Kale said. "But I don't think that will be the case. Too many small things point toward Nolan for this to simply be coincidence. The overnight watch pattern, his report placing your scent somewhere you never went, the timing of it all. Something is there. I intend to find it." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her, the way he had the morning before, something steady and reassuring in his gaze, despite the danger of what he was about to attempt. "Trust me a little longer, Elena. We're close." "I don't have much of a choice," she said, though there was less bitterness in the words than there might have been 2 days earlier. Somewhere in the last 2 days, without quite realizing when it happened, she had begun to trust him, not just because she needed to, but because everything he had done since that first knock on her door had been careful, deliberate, and entirely in service of finding the truth, rather than simply comforting her with empty promises. After he left, Elena sat alone in her cabin, the single candle burning low, counting the minutes as they crawled past with unbearable slowness. She thought about Nolan, trying to recall every interaction she'd ever had with him, searching for some clue she might have missed, some reason he would go to such lengths to frame her, for something he had done. She could think of nothing. Whatever his motive was, it remained as much a mystery to her as the theft itself. An hour passed. Then another quarter hour beyond that, each minute stretching longer than the last, until finally she could no longer sit still, and pulled her cloak around her shoulders, to make her way toward the old grain store, where Kale had asked her to meet him. The night was clear and cold, the moon not yet full but bright enough to light her path without a torch. She kept to the shadows as much as she could, avoiding the main paths where she might run into anyone who recognized her, until she reached the old grain store, a structure long since abandoned in favor of newer, larger storage buildings, closer to the center of the pack grounds. Kale was already there, waiting in the darkness near the entrance, and the moment she saw his face, lit faintly by the moonlight, she knew he had found something. "Well?" she asked, breathless from both the walk and the anticipation. He held up a small, worn leather journal, its cover cracked with age and use. "This was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters," he said. "It took longer to find than I expected, which tells me he was careful about hiding it, but not careful enough." "What is it?" "Records," Kale said. "Detailed notes on territory boundaries, alliance agreements, information that would be extremely valuable to any pack looking to expand into land that currently belongs to us. Exactly the kind of material that was kept in the vault." Elena's breath caught. "He's been planning to sell it, to another pack." "That's my suspicion," Kale said, "though I haven't confirmed who he might be working with yet. But this proves the theft, Elena, and more importantly, it proves you had nothing to do with it." Relief flooded through her, so sudden and overwhelming that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. For the first time since the accusation had been spoken aloud in that great hall, she allowed herself to believe, fully and completely, that this nightmare might actually end the way it should have from the very beginning. "We have to bring this to Dorian," she said. "Tonight, before he can do anything else, before he even realizes it's missing." "We will," Cale said, "but we need to be smart about how we present it. Dorian isn't going to simply accept a stolen journal as proof without pressing for exactly how we obtained it, and searching another pack member's quarters without authorization isn't something he'll overlook easily, no matter what it reveals." "Then what do we do?" Cale's expression turned thoughtful, calculating, the same careful strategy she'd seen from him since this had all begun. "We gather the rest of the pack," he said, "tomorrow, at dawn, before Dorian can finalize anything. And we let the truth speak for itself, in front of everyone who watched you condemned 2 nights ago." Elena looked at the journal in his hands, at the small, unassuming object that held the power to undo everything Dorian had so confidently declared in front of the entire pack. One more night, and then the truth would finally have its chance to be heard. Neither of them slept that night. They sat together in the old grain store until the sky began to lighten, poring over the journal page by page, cataloging every entry that might strengthen the case against Nolan. Elena had never seen Cale work with such focused intensity, his usual stillness replaced by a quiet, methodical urgency as he cross-referenced dates in the journal against the watch schedule he had already gathered. "Look at this," he said at one point, turning the journal toward her and pointing at an entry near the back. "This isn't just territory information. He's recorded specific dates and outlines for meeting with someone outside our pack, someone he refers to only as the contact, never by name." Elena leaned closer, reading the cramped handwriting by the dim light of the lantern they had risked bringing into the abandoned building. 3 meetings, she said, all within the last 2 months, all near the northern boundary. "The northern boundary borders the Ashford territory," Cale said, his jaw tightening. "If Nolan has been meeting with someone from Ashford Pack, feeding them our territory agreements and alliance records, that's not simply theft. That's a betrayal that could put every single person in this pack at risk." The weight of what they were uncovering settled over Elena like a physical thing. This was no longer only about clearing her name, though that mattered more to her than she could put into words. This was about something far larger, a threat to the entire pack that had been quietly building for months, while everyone remained blind to it, distracted instead by a false accusation that had conveniently pointed suspicion in exactly the wrong direction. "Do you think that's why he did it?" she asked. "Framed me, I mean. Not just to cover his own theft, but because he needed someone to blame quickly, before anyone started asking harder questions about what was actually happening?" "It's possible," Cale said. "You were an easy target. No family left to advocate for you, a habit of walking near that exact path most evenings, and no reason for anyone to suspect you had any connection to territory politics or outside alliances. If I were trying to misdirect an investigation, I couldn't have designed a better decoy." The clinical way he said it should have stung, but instead, Elena found a strange kind of comfort in it. It wasn't personal. It had never been personal. She had simply been convenient, a name easy to attach to a crime that needed a face quickly, before anyone looked too closely at what was actually happening beneath the surface. "We need to move carefully," Cale continued, closing the journal and tucking it securely inside his cloak. "If Nolan has been in contact with someone from Ashford territory, there's a chance he already knows we're getting close, or will know soon enough once he realizes his journal is missing. We can't afford to wait longer than tomorrow morning to bring this in front of the pack." "You said we'd gather everyone at dawn," Elena said. "That's only a few hours away now." "It is," Cale agreed, "which means we need to decide exactly how we present this, and to whom, before the sun rises." "Not Dorian first," Elena said, an idea forming as she spoke. "If we go to Dorian privately, he'll have time to decide how to handle it quietly, maybe even protect Nolan if there's some connection between them we don't know about, or simply because admitting he sentenced an innocent person to exile without proper investigation will embarrass him in front of the entire pack. We need to bring this forward publicly, the same way my accusation was made, in front of everyone." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his careful expression. That's a bold approach, he said. It also means there's no room for anyone to quietly bury the truth once it's spoken aloud. But it also means you'll be standing in that same hall again, in front of the same people who condemned you 2 nights ago, with everything riding on this evidence holding up under scrutiny. I can handle that, Elena said, and she found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. Something had shifted in her over the past 2 days. The fear that had gripped her in that first gathering, slowly giving way to something steadier, something closer to resolve. I'd rather face them with the truth in my hands than spend one more day letting them believe a lie. Then we do it your way, Cale said. At dawn, in the Great Hall, in front of everyone. They spent the remaining hours before sunrise preparing exactly what they would say, anticipating the questions Dorian would inevitably raise, the objections he might try to use to discredit the journal, or the manner in which it had been found. Cale was thorough in a way that impressed Elena more with every passing minute, considering angles she hadn't thought to question, building a case that felt less like a desperate defense and more like an undeniable presentation of fact. As the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the cracks in the old grain store's walls, Cale sent word through a trusted pack member to gather everyone in the Great Hall, using the same authority he had held back so carefully 2 nights before. This time, there would be no hiding in the shadows, no quiet observation from the corner of the room. This time, he intended to speak. The walk from the grain store to the Great Hall felt entirely different from the walk Elena had taken toward that same building 2 nights earlier. Then, she had been consumed by fear and confusion, blindsided by an accusation she never saw coming. Now, walking beside Cale in the pale light of early morning, the journal secured safely between them, she felt something closer to purpose, though the fear had not entirely disappeared. It had simply been joined by something stronger. Pack members were already gathering as they arrived, many of them clearly confused by the early hour and the unusual nature of the summons. Elena caught sight of Marin near the edge of the crowd, her expression uncertain, and Callum, standing a short distance away, glancing nervously toward the front of the hall, where Dorian stood waiting, his arms crossed in the same defensive posture he'd held 2 nights before. Dorian's eyes narrowed the moment he saw Elena walking beside Cale, the journal now openly visible in Cale's hand. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice carrying easily across the hall even before everyone had fully assembled. "I told you the matter was settled, Elena. Your continued presence here does nothing but delay the inevitable." "The matter isn't settled," Cale said, stepping forward, and his voice, though not raised, carried an authority that immediately silenced the murmuring crowd. "I have evidence that proves Elena did not break the seal on the vault, and evidence pointing directly toward the person who did." The hall fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Every eye that had once looked away from Elena now turned fully toward her and Cale, waiting to see what would unfold next. "This is a serious claim," Dorian said, though something in his confident posture had shifted, a faint crack of uncertainty entering his voice for the first time since Elena had known him. "I hope you have something more substantial than suspicion to back it up." "I do," Cale said, holding up the leather journal for the entire hall to see. "This belongs to Nolan. It was found hidden beneath a floorboard in his quarters, and it contains detailed records of territory information matching exactly what was stolen from the vault, along with documentation of multiple secret meetings with a contact near the northern boundary, close to Ashford territory." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. Elena scanned the faces around her and found Nolan standing near the back of the hall, his expression frozen, the color visibly draining from his face as every eye in the room began turning slowly toward him instead of her. "That's not possible," Nolan said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the denial convincing. "I don't know what you're talking about. That journal isn't mine." "Your handwriting is distinctive," Cale said calmly, opening the journal to a page they had marked the night before. "I compared it against the watch reports you've filed over the past several months. They match, and your overnight watch assignments over the last 6 months conveniently align with nearly every documented meeting recorded in these pages." Nolan's eyes darted around the hall, searching for some escape route that clearly did not exist. The pack, which had been so quick to condemn Elena based on nothing more than a claimed scent match, now stood watching him with the same suspicious, unforgiving attention that had once been directed entirely at her. "You framed me," Elena said, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "You needed someone to blame quickly, before anyone started asking real questions about what you'd actually been doing. I was convenient, easy to point toward. No one left to defend me. That's not, Nolan started, but the words died in his throat as Dorian moved toward him, his expression darkening with a fury Elena had never seen, directed at anyone other than herself over the past 2 days. Is this true? Dorian demanded, his voice cutting through whatever excuse Nolan had been about to attempt. The silence that followed stretched long enough that it became its own answer. Nolan's shoulders slumped, the last of his composure crumbling under the weight of 40 pairs of eyes now fixed entirely on him. I needed the money, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried clearly through the silent hall. Ashford Pack offered more than I could ever earn here. I thought if I moved quickly, took what I needed, and pointed suspicion elsewhere, no one would ever look closely enough to catch me. And Elena? Dorian pressed. You were willing to let her carry the blame for something she never did. Willing to let her lose everything, her home, her pack, her entire life here, simply to protect yourself. Nolan said nothing, but the silence spoke loudly enough. Elena felt something complicated rise in her chest, not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something closer to a strange, heavy exhaustion, the weight of 2 sleepless days, and the terror of an unearned sentence finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. Dorian turned toward her, and for the first time since the accusation had begun, she saw something in his expression that resembled genuine regret. Elena, he said, his voice quieter now than it had been at any point during the original judgment. I owe you an apology. I acted too quickly, trusted evidence I should have questioned more carefully, and nearly cost you everything because of it. The apology should have felt like enough. In some ways, it was more than she had expected to receive at all. But standing there in the same hall where she had been condemned 2 nights before, surrounded by the same faces that had looked away from her without a single word of defense, Elena found that the apology, however sincere, could not entirely undo what those 2 days had cost her. She looked around the hall at Marin, at Callum, at Ivy, all of them watching her now with expressions of guilt and relief mixed together. None of them met her eyes for long before looking away again, though this time it seemed to be shame rather than suspicion driving their gaze elsewhere. Only Cale continued looking at her steadily, the same unwavering attention he had shown from the very first moment in that corner of the hall, and in that steady gaze, Elena found something far more grounding than Dorian's apology could ever provide. The truth had finally been spoken aloud in front of everyone, but as Elena stood in the center of that circle once more, this time cleared rather than condemned, she understood that clearing her name was only the beginning of what still needed to be rebuilt. Nolan was taken into custody before the sun had fully risen, escorted from the hall by 2 of Dorian's most trusted enforcers, while the rest of the pack watched in stunned silence. Elena expected to feel satisfaction watching him led away, the same satisfaction she imagined he must have felt watching her condemned 2 nights earlier. Instead, she felt only a hollow kind of relief, the sense of a burden lifting, rather than any real joy in his downfall. This isn't finished, Cale said quietly, once the hall had begun to empty, and only a handful of pack members remained, lingering near the doors, as if unsure whether they were still welcome to stay. Nolan admitted to selling territory information to Ashford Pack, but he hasn't told us what they intend to do with it, or how far their plans have already progressed. Elena felt the small measure of peace she'd allowed herself begin to slip away again. You think there's more to this than one journal and a few secret meetings? I think Ashford has been patient, Cale said. Patient enough to cultivate a source inside our pack for months, rather than making a direct move. That kind of patience usually means they're planning something larger than simple information gathering. I need to know what Nolan actually gave them, and how recently he last made contact. Dorian approached them then, his earlier composure still visibly shaken, though he had clearly worked to steady himself before addressing the 2 of them directly. Nolan will be questioned thoroughly, he said. I intend to know everything he's shared with Ashford before I decide how to proceed. But I want to speak with both of you privately first, away from the rest of the pack. They followed him to a smaller chamber adjoining the Great Hall, a room Elena had never entered before, its walls lined with old maps and territory records that predated even her mother's time in the pack. Dorian closed the door behind them, and turned to face Elena directly, something heavy and uncomfortable settling over his features. I failed you, he said, without preamble. 2 nights ago, I stood in front of this entire pack and condemned you, based on evidence I never questioned closely enough. I let my need for a quick resolution outweigh my responsibility to seek the actual truth, and I very nearly sent an innocent person into exile because of it. I don't expect you to forgive that easily, and I won't ask you to." Elena studied him for a long moment, surprised by the rawness in his voice, so different from the flat, unyielding authority he'd carried through her original judgment. "I don't forgive it easily," she said honestly, "but I understand why it happened. The evidence seemed convincing. You were trying to protect the pack." "That doesn't excuse the way I handled it," Dorian said. "I should have allowed more time for investigation before rushing to sentencing. I should have listened when you insisted on your innocence, instead of dismissing it as simple denial. Going forward, I intend to make certain nothing like this happens again, to you or to anyone else in this pack." "How?" Elena asked, genuinely curious, despite the lingering hurt still sitting heavy in her chest. "By changing how accusations of this nature are handled," Dorian said. "No sentencing without a full investigation period, regardless of how convincing the initial evidence appears. And I intend to formally credit Cale's involvement in uncovering the truth, which brings me to something else I need to discuss." He turned toward Cale, his expression shifting into something more businesslike, though the underlying respect was unmistakable. "You went outside proper channels to investigate this," Dorian said. "Searching Nolan's quarters without authorization is not something I can simply overlook, regardless of what it revealed." "I understand," Cale said, his voice steady, showing no sign of concern despite the potential consequences hanging over the conversation. "However," Dorian continued, "given what your investigation uncovered, and given that proper channels would likely have taken far longer than the 3 days Elena had remaining before her exile became permanent, I'm willing to consider this an exception, rather than a pattern requiring punishment. But I need your word that in the future, when concerns like this arise, you bring them to me directly, rather than acting entirely on your own. You already had a source inside this pack, feeding information to Ashford territory," Cale said, a slight edge entering his otherwise composed tone. "Forgive me for not trusting that proper channels would have moved quickly enough, or stayed contained enough, to protect Elena, or uncover the full truth before real damage was done." Dorian's jaw tightened, but he did not argue the point further, perhaps recognizing the validity buried within Cale's blunt assessment. "Fair enough," he said finally. "But going forward, I'd rather have you working alongside me on matters like this, than working around me. Your instincts proved sharper than mine this time. I'd be foolish not to make use of that going forward." The conversation shifted after that toward more practical matters, Dorian outlining his plans to question Nolan thoroughly, to reach out to trusted contacts who might have information about Ashford Pack's current movements and intentions, to strengthen security around the vault and other sensitive records that had clearly proven far more vulnerable than anyone had realized. Elena listened to most of it in a kind of exhausted daze, the adrenaline that had carried her through the sleepless night, and the dramatic confrontation finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep tiredness she hadn't fully registered until now. It was Cale who noticed first, glancing toward her with something gentler than his usual careful neutrality. "She needs rest," he said, cutting into whatever Dorian had been saying. "This conversation can continue later. Right now, Elena hasn't slept properly in 2 days, and I don't think either of us is thinking as clearly as we should be, after everything that's happened this morning." Dorian nodded, some of the businesslike urgency softening in his expression. "Of course, we'll continue this later. Elena, again, I am sorry for how this began. I hope, in time, you'll be willing to trust this pack again, even after everything that's happened." Elena did not have an answer ready for that, not yet. Trust, once broken so completely, was not something that could be rebuilt with a single apology, however sincere. But she nodded anyway, too tired to find better words in the moment, and allowed Cale to guide her out of the chamber and back toward her cabin. They walked in silence for most of the way, the pack grounds around them slowly filling with the ordinary bustle of morning routines, though Elena noticed the way people's expressions shifted when they caught sight of her now, no longer the careful avoidance of the past 2 days, but something closer to open curiosity, occasionally even respect, as word of what had happened in the Great Hall began spreading through the pack. "You didn't have to fight for me the way you did," Elena said finally. breaking the silence as they approached her cabin. "You could have let Dorian's investigation happen through proper channels, the way he wanted. You put yourself at risk for someone you barely knew." "I told you before," Kale said. "I've watched this pack fail people, because it was easier than asking hard questions. I wasn't willing to watch that happen again, not when I had the ability to prevent it." "That's not a complete answer," Elena said, studying him carefully. "You said that the same thing 2 mornings ago, and I let it go then, because I didn't have the energy to push further. But I don't think that's the whole truth, is it? Who did this pack fail before, Kale?" Something shifted behind his careful expression, a flicker of old pain quickly suppressed, but not quite hidden fast enough. "My sister," he said finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Years ago, before you would have been old enough to remember it clearly. She was accused of something she didn't do, much the same way you were. Convenient evidence, no one willing to look closer, a pack eager for a quick resolution, rather than the harder work of finding actual truth. What happened to her?" "She was exiled," Kale said. "I was too young at the time, too low in standing within the pack to do anything to stop it. I watched the same silence fall over that hall that fell over it 2 nights ago, when you stood there pleading your innocence, and I couldn't do anything except watch. She left, and I never saw her again. I don't know if she's even still alive." Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her, understanding now, finally, the depth of what had driven his careful, deliberate actions over the past 3 days. This had never been only about her. It had been about a debt owed to someone he'd lost long ago, a wrong he'd never had the power to make right until now. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what happened to her. And thank you, for not letting the same thing happen to me." Kale nodded, something raw and unguarded passing briefly across his features, before the familiar composure settled back into place. "Rest, Elena," he said. "You've earned it. We'll talk more once you've had proper sleep, and once we know more about what Ashford Territory actually intends to do with whatever information Nolan already shared with them." He left her at the door of her cabin, and Elena watched him walk away, the weight of everything he'd just shared with her, settling heavy and complicated in her chest. She understood now why he had stood in that corner 3 nights ago, unwilling to speak but unable to look away, carrying the memory of a sister he'd failed to save, and determined, whatever the cost, not to fail someone else the same way twice. She stepped inside her cabin, finally alone, and allowed the exhaustion of the past 3 days to fully claim her. As she drifted toward sleep, her mind kept circling back to the image of Kale, standing silently in that corner, watching when everyone else looked away, and she understood now that his silence had never been indifference at all. It had been the quiet, careful patience of someone determined to make sure the truth, this time, would not be buried by convenience. But even as sleep finally pulled her under, a small, uneasy thought lingered at the edges of her mind. Nolan's arrest had answered one question, but it had opened another far larger and more dangerous one. Somewhere beyond the borders of their territory, Ashford Pack was still out there, still holding whatever secrets Nolan had already handed over, and there was no way yet to know exactly what they intended to do with the information now sitting in their hands. 3 days later, the messenger arrived. Elena was at the storehouse when Greta called her name, her voice tight with an urgency that immediately set Elena's nerves on edge. She stepped outside to find a young pack member she barely recognized, standing at the entrance, breathless from running, his eyes wide with alarm. "Dorian wants everyone gathered," he said. "Now. Something's happened at the northern boundary." Elena's stomach dropped. She left the storehouse without another word, moving quickly toward the great hall, her mind already racing through possibilities, none of them good. By the time she arrived, a crowd had already gathered, and she found Kale standing near the front, his expression harder and more focused than she'd seen since the morning they'd confronted Nolan. "What's happening?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "A patrol found signs of movement along the northern boundary early this morning," Kale said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly amid the murmuring crowd. "Tracks, multiple sets, moving in formation, rather than scattered the way wild wolves typically travel. It has the markings of a scouting party." "Ashford," Elena said, the words settling like a stone in her chest. "That's my assumption," Kale said. "Whatever information Nolan handed over, it seems Ashford is finally ready to act on it." Dorian moved to the front of the hall, and the murmuring crowd fell silent, the same heavy anticipation from the morning of Nolan's exposure settling over the room once more, though this time the danger felt far more immediate, far more threatening to every single person gathered there. 3 days ago, we discovered that Nolan had been feeding sensitive territory information to Ashford Pack for several months, Dorian said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. This morning, a patrol found evidence suggesting Ashford scouts have moved along our northern boundary, likely testing our defenses before a larger move. I don't intend to wait and find out what that larger move might be. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd, and Elena felt it too. The same cold uncertainty she'd felt 3 nights ago when her own fate hung in the balance, except now, the stakes extended to the entire pack, rather than just herself. "What do we know about their numbers?" someone called from the crowd. "Not enough," Dorian admitted, "which is why I need volunteers, willing to scout closer to the boundary, to determine exactly what we're facing, before we decide how to respond. This isn't an order. Given the risk involved, I won't command anyone into this, but I need people I can trust, people with sharp instincts and steady judgment." Cale stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll go." Elena felt a spike of fear at his immediate volunteering, though she understood, watching the resolve in his expression, that there had never been any real chance he would stay behind. "I'm coming too," she said, surprising herself as much as anyone else in the hall with how quickly the words left her mouth. Cale turned to her, something caught between concern and reluctant respect crossing his face. "Elena, this isn't like uncovering evidence in a quiet cabin. This is dangerous. Real danger. Not the kind you can outthink your way around." "I know that," Elena said, holding his gaze steadily, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "But I'm not going to sit here and wait for someone else to protect this pack, not after everything that's happened. I want to help. I need to help." Dorian watched the exchange with an unreadable expression before finally nodding. "If you're both willing, I won't refuse the offer. But you'll move carefully, and you'll report back the moment you have useful information, rather than engaging directly with anything you encounter. Am I understood?" "Understood," Cale said, and Elena echoed the word, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she wondered if everyone in the hall could hear it. They set out within the hour, moving quickly and quietly through the forest, toward the northern boundary, the terrain growing steadily, more unfamiliar, the further they traveled from the pack's central grounds. Elena had rarely ventured this far from home, and the wildness of the landscape here, dense trees pressing close together, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches, only heightened the sense that they were moving into territory far more dangerous than anything she'd faced before. "Stay close," Cale said quietly, his senses clearly alert to every small sound around them. "And stay quiet. If Ashford scouts are still in the area, we don't want to announce our presence before we've had a chance to assess what we're dealing with." They moved carefully through the trees, following the same path the earlier patrol had reported finding tracks along, Cale pausing every so often to examine the ground, reading signs Elena couldn't fully interpret herself. "Here," he said eventually, crouching beside a cluster of disturbed earth. "At least 4 sets of tracks, maybe 5. Moving north to south, then doubling back. They were watching something, or someone. Watching us," Elena said, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the cold forest air. "Possibly," Cale agreed. "Or gathering information about our boundary patrols, our schedules, the same kind of intelligence Nolan was already providing them. This could simply be confirmation of what they already knew, rather than the start of something new." They continued forward cautiously, the forest growing quieter around them, an unsettling stillness that made every snapped twig or rustling leaf feel amplified in the tense silence. Elena found herself watching Cale as much as she watched their surroundings, drawing a strange kind of steadiness from his calm, methodical focus, even as her own nerves stretched tighter with every step. It was Cale who caught the scent first, his body going suddenly still, one hand raised in a silent signal for her to stop moving. "Someone's close," he whispered, barely audible. "Not Pack. The scent is unfamiliar." Elena's heart slammed against her ribs as she followed his gaze toward a dense cluster of trees ahead of them, straining to see any sign of movement in the deepening shadows. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened, the forest holding its breath along with both of them. Then a figure emerged from the trees, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the muted colors typical of scouts trained to move unseen through unfamiliar territory. His eyes found them immediately, no surprise registering on his face, which told Elena with sickening clarity that he had known exactly where they were, long before they had spotted him. "Kale," the stranger said, his voice carrying an easy, unsettling confidence. "It's been a long time." Kale's posture shifted, something tightening in his shoulders that Elena had never seen from him before, not even in the tensest moments of the past few days. "Rowan," he said, and there was history in the single word, old and complicated, though Elena had no context yet to understand exactly what it meant. "You know him," Elena said quietly, though it wasn't really a question. "We grew up together," Kale said, his eyes never leaving the stranger, before he left this pack to join Ashford territory. Rowan's expression shifted into something almost amused, though there was a coldness underneath it that made Elena's instincts scream danger. "I heard you finally caught our little source," he said. "Nolan was useful while he lasted, though I suppose that usefulness has run its course now." "You're admitting Ashford orchestrated this," Kale said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension radiating from him. "I'm admitting nothing," Rowan said easily. "I'm simply here to deliver a message. Ashford territory has grown tired of the boundaries your pack insists on maintaining, land that would serve our people far better than it currently serves yours. We know your defenses now, thanks to Nolan's cooperation, and we know exactly how thin they've become in certain places." "Is that a threat?" Elena asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out, despite the fear coursing through her. Rowan's gaze shifted toward her for the first time, studying her with an unsettling curiosity. "And who is this?" "Not someone I recognize from the records Nolan provided us." "Someone who has nothing to do with this conversation," Kale said sharply, stepping slightly in front of Elena, a protective instinct that did not go unnoticed by either her or Rowan. Rowan's smile widened slightly, as if he'd learned something valuable simply from that small, involuntary movement. "Interesting," he said. "Well, regardless, deliver my message to whoever leads your pack these days. Ashford intends to move on the northern boundary within the next several days. You can prepare, or you can accept the inevitable. Either way, the outcome will be the same." Before Kale could respond, Rowan turned and disappeared back into the trees, as quickly and silently as he had emerged, leaving Elena and Kale standing alone, in the tense, unsettled quiet of the forest. "We need to get back," Kale said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "Dorian needs to hear this immediately." They moved quickly back toward the pack grounds, the earlier caution replaced now by genuine urgency, Elena's mind racing through everything Rowan had said, the confident, almost casual way he had delivered what amounted to a declaration of coming conflict. This was no longer simply about clearing her name or exposing a single traitor within their ranks. This was about survival, about protecting everything and everyone she had spent the last few days fighting so hard to remain part of. As they ran through the darkening forest, Elena found herself thinking, strangely, of that first night in the Great Hall, standing alone in the center of a circle of averted eyes. She had believed then that nothing could feel more frightening than facing exile alone. She understood now, with the weight of Rowan's warning settling heavy in her chest, that she had been wrong. The greatest fear was not standing alone. It was standing together, with everyone she cared about, and still not knowing if it would be enough to keep them all safe. They reached the pack grounds just as darkness fully settled over the territory, and within minutes, Dorian had gathered every capable pack member into the Great Hall once more. This time not for judgment, but for preparation. Elena stood beside Kale as he relayed everything Rowan had told them, watching the faces around the hall shift from confusion to alarm to a hardening resolve that reminded her, oddly, of the same collective energy that had once been turned against her. This time, that resolve was aimed outward, toward a genuine threat, rather than inward at one of their own. "We have perhaps 3 days before Ashford moves," Dorian said, once Kale had finished his report. "That gives us time to strengthen the northern boundary, but not much room for error. I need every able-bodied pack member ready to defend our territory, and I need scouts stationed along the boundary in shifts, watching for any further movement." The hall erupted into organized activity, pack members breaking into smaller groups to discuss assignments, supplies, defensive positions. Elena found herself swept into the preparations alongside everyone else, her earlier isolation entirely forgotten in the urgent need for every capable hand. Marin approached her at one point, helping to organize medical supplies, and for the first time since the accusation, they worked side by side without the weight of suspicion hanging between them. "I should have said something that first night," Marin said quietly, not looking up from the bandages she was sorting. "I knew you, Elena. I should have trusted that more than I trusted Dorian's evidence." "You were afraid," Elena said, and found that she meant the understanding in her voice. Everyone was. Fear makes people quiet when they should be loud. "That doesn't make it right," Marin said. "No," Elena agreed, "but it makes it human. I'd rather have you here now, working beside me, than hold on to anger about something that's already been corrected." Marin looked up then, something grateful passing across her face, and the two of them continued working together, in a silence that felt, for the first time in days, comfortable rather than strained. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation, Elena finding herself constantly busy, useful in ways that left little time for the fear that still lingered beneath the surface of every conversation about Ashford's coming move. She caught glimpses of Cale throughout, coordinating scout rotations with Dorian, reviewing defensive strategies late into the night, his usual quiet composure now channeled entirely into the urgent work of protecting the pack. On the evening before the third day, the day Rowan had promised Ashford would move, Cale found Elena near the edge of the training grounds, where she had been practicing basic defensive techniques with a small group of other pack members who, like her, had little formal combat experience. "You've improved quickly," he said, watching her complete a defensive maneuver one of the more experienced fighters had been teaching. "I've had good motivation," Elena said, slightly breathless from the exertion. "I'm not interested in standing helpless if Ashford actually attacks tomorrow." Cale studied her for a moment, something warm and complicated behind his careful expression. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow," he said, "in case things don't go the way we're hoping." Elena's stomach tightened at the words, but she nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "These past several days," Cale said, seeming to choose his words carefully, "have been unlike anything I've experienced in a long time. I've spent years keeping this pack at a careful distance, watching from the edges, never fully allowing myself to trust that speaking up would actually change anything, not after what happened to my sister. But watching you fight for the truth, refusing to simply accept the fate that had been handed to you, it reminded me why that distance was never really the answer. You helped save me," Elena said softly. "That's not something I'll ever be able to fully repay." "I don't need repayment," Cale said. What I've realized I need, is exactly what you've already given me, without either of us fully realizing it. A reason to stop standing in corners, watching silently while everything unfolds around me. A reason to actually step forward." Elena felt her heart quicken, understanding the weight beneath his careful words, the vulnerability he was allowing himself to show her after days of careful, controlled composure. "You've already stepped forward," she said, "more than once, over these past few days." "Only because of you," Cale said. "I need you to know that, before tomorrow, before any of us know exactly how this confrontation with Ashford will unfold. Whatever happens, I don't intend to go back to watching silently from the shadows again, not after this." The moment stretched between them, charged with everything neither of them had quite found the words to say directly, until Elena closed the small distance separating them and pressed her hand gently against his. "Then let's make sure there's a tomorrow worth stepping forward into," she said. Cale's fingers closed around hers, steady and warm, and for a moment, standing together at the edge of the training grounds with the weight of an uncertain battle looming ahead of them, Elena felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in days. Not just hope, but a quiet, grounded certainty that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The following morning arrived with a tense, watchful stillness settling over the entire pack. Scouts reported movement along the northern boundary shortly after dawn, confirming that Ashford's promised move had indeed begun. Dorian mobilized the defensive positions they had spent the past 2 days preparing, and Elena found herself stationed alongside Cale and a dozen other pack members near the boundary line, watching the tree line for the first signs of Ashford's approach. What followed was tense, careful negotiation, rather than the violent confrontation Elena had feared. Dorian, flanked by Cale and several of the pack's most trusted senior members, met with Ashford's leadership at the boundary line, presenting evidence of Nolan's betrayal and making clear that the pack was fully prepared to defend their territory, having lost the element of surprise that Ashford had clearly been counting on. Faced with a pack now fully aware of their plans and thoroughly prepared to defend against them, Ashford's leadership, after hours of tense discussion, ultimately withdrew their scouts and agreed to formal boundary negotiations, rather than risk an open confrontation that would cost them far more than they stood to gain. It was not a perfect resolution. Tensions between the two territories would likely simmer for a long time to come, but it was a resolution that avoided the violence everyone had feared, and one that Dorian credited, in front of the entire pack once the danger had passed, directly to the intelligence Cale and Elena had gathered. In the weeks that followed, the pack slowly settled back into a version of normal life, though it was a different normal than the one Elena had known before the accusation. Nolan was formally exiled, his betrayal too significant for any lesser punishment, and though Elena felt no satisfaction in his downfall, she understood the necessity of it, the same way she understood that some trust, once broken, could never be fully restored to what it once was. Her relationship with the wider pack healed slowly, not through grand gestures, but through small, ordinary moments. Shared meals with Merrin that no longer felt strained. Callum finally finding the courage to apologize properly for his silence that first night, an apology Elena accepted with more grace than she might have offered a week earlier. Even Ivy, who had never quite forgiven herself for looking away, gradually found her way back into an easy, comfortable friendship with Elena over the following months. But it was her relationship with Cale that changed most completely of all. What had begun as a quiet, unexpected act of belief in her innocence slowly grew into something neither of them had anticipated, a partnership built first on shared purpose and steadily deepening into something far more personal. He no longer stood silently in corners, watching from the edges of gatherings. He spoke up now, in pack meetings, in quiet moments with Elena, in the small, ordinary conversations that made up the fabric of daily life within their community. Dorian, true to his word, formally recognized Cale's role in uncovering the truth, elevating his standing within the pack's leadership structure, though Cale accepted the recognition with the same quiet humility he brought to everything else. More importantly to Elena, he had kept his promise to himself, the promise made in a tense moment before Ashford's threatened attack, never to retreat back into silent observation when speaking up could actually change the outcome for someone who needed it. Months later, standing together at the edge of the same river where Elena had once sat alone, on the night that changed everything, she found herself thinking back to that terrible night in the Great Hall, the circle of averted eyes, the crushing weight of standing accused, with no one willing to defend her. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" she asked Cale, watching the water move steadily past them in the fading evening light, "if you hadn't decided to step forward that first night?" Cale considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "I think about my sister, and how differently things might have gone for her if someone had been willing to look closer instead of accepting the easiest explanation. I couldn't change what happened to her, but I could make sure I never made that same mistake again, not while I had the power to prevent it." "You saved more than just my place in this pack," Elena said. "You saved something in yourself too, I think. The part that had gone quiet for so long." Cale turned to look at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression, so different from the careful, unreadable exterior he had once worn, like armor in that great hall. "Maybe I did," he said. "Or maybe I simply found someone worth stepping forward for." Elena smiled, leaning into him, as the last light of evening faded over the water, the ache of that terrible night finally settling into something she could carry, without it weighing her down entirely. She had learned, through everything that happened, that justice rarely arrived quickly or easily, and that sometimes it required exactly one person willing to look closer, to question the convenient story, to stand firm when everyone else looked away. She had found that person in the quiet, watchful figure, who had once stood silently in the corner of a hall, filled with averted eyes. And in finding him, she had found her way back not just to her place within the pack, but to a version of herself stronger and steadier than the frightened woman who had once stood alone in the center of that circle, crying out into a silence that no longer defined her. The nights of standing accused and alone were behind her now. What remained ahead was something she had never quite believed she would find again after that terrible night. A sense of belonging, built not on convenience or easy assumptions, but on truth, on courage, and on the quiet, steady presence of someone who had chosen, against every instinct, to remain silent, to stand.